So we've introduced 3 of the speakers. We haven't introduced one of them. And I'm not going to read you a bio. I'm just going to tell you what I know about them. Okay? So if you want more details in their bio, you can go to our website. But I want to just tell you who they are. And a lot of people have been coming up to me and they're saying, how in the world did you get all of these people together to come speak at this conference? And the answer is, I understood how important it would be to you. I understood how meaningful it would. I understand that a lot of us are bombarded with advertising and messages about what to eat, that our friends, that our family, that the media insist that we eat the Atkins diet, the paleo diet, and it's relentless. So I felt that if we could get several people who were so clear and confident in their information together, maybe it would help us to feel a little more confident in the world where we're constantly hearing this message from people that are trying to sell things, that are people that are not necessarily on our side. So the first person I want to introduce is Dr. Pam Popper. And Dr. Popper, aside from being a wonderful, intelligent woman who speaks very passionately about this subject, I think there is no agenda here. This is a woman who is passionately researching all the information out here. She's looking at it. She doesn't have an agenda. She's not even, in the past when I've asked her about veganism, she's not militant. She's looking out for you. She understands you're all different. She's looking at the natural world. She's looking at the medical world. And she is giving you the best information out there. I don't have that many sources that I know like that, so I'm thankful to introduce Dr. Pam Popper. Dr. Kim Williams, who I will introduce tomorrow in detail, I saw for the first time at Vegetarian Summerfest. He is the past president of the American Association of Cardiology, and he spoke about his experience. So this is kind of interesting because this is the person who is the president of all the Association for all the cardiologists in the United States, that association that represents cardiologists, the people who are the top advisors on heart. He was the president, so I felt this was a very powerful and unusual thing to have the person who was the head of that group that should hopefully have the most influence on the country, that he was promoting a plant-based diet. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Kim Williams. I guess Dr. Esselstyn is someone that we all know, and we've been reading his information for a long time. And I guess for a lot of the world, they want to hear it from someone that's in the trenches. And Dr. Esselstyn has been in the trenches for a long time, dealing with real people, doing real research. It's not a theory. He's not giving you an idea. He's not telling you what he read. He is hardcore. He was the one who did it. He spoke to the patients. So it's when he says he did this study, he's not saying I had a bunch of clinicians do everything and I was traveling around the world. He was meeting with these people for 12 years, originally every week, then on a regular basis. So this information combined with his medical experience and his incredible studies really makes him an authority like very few people on the planet. And for those of you that didn't hear, he had done an original study, and he wrote a book called Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease. But then, a few years ago, he did the most shocking study. I had to look at it 10 times to see if I was reading it right, where out of like 200 people, I don't want to say it wrong, but out of around 198 people, there was like 160 people, I'm saying it wrong, but he'll correct me, but like 160, 70 people who had previous heart issues, went on a whole food plant-based diet, and after 3 3/4 years, only one of those people had a health issue, where the 25 or 23 or so that didn't follow it had like 60% had problems. It was so shocking that it should have been on the front page of every paper in the United States. It should be on the front page of every paper every day. It's almost insane. It is insane that it's not known everywhere. So we're very grateful and thankful to Dr. Esselstyn for being here. And I apologize for saying the numbers slightly off. And Dr. T. Colin Campbell has been someone who has played a very important role for a lot of people, because a lot of us intuitively know a lot of things, but sometimes it's good to have someone with confidence to say it. So as much as a lot of us intuitively felt there was something deeply wrong with the American diet, when he said, I am going to do the most detailed study, the study that the New York Times called the Grand Prix of studies, that, you know, they considered like an unheard of study. When he did it, spent his life doing it in precise detail with perfect scientific precision, and then wrote about it and followed up on it. He gave, I remember when someone told me about the book for the first time, it was so like validating that someone had finally taken stuff that made sense and that we knew and put into a study and made it available to us. However, a lot of you might not be aware that that wasn't really where he's at now. Although the China study was monumental for many of us, Dr. Campbell has intensely persisted since then and is very passionate about the fact that the scientific community is not completely on our side. And he is passionately interested in that. So he did not stop his work when the China study came out. He is still full blaze trying to let everyone know what is really true from the scientific community and what is not. So I speak for all the people around the country on live stream, all the people in the audience here, and all the people that are watching this on YouTube one day and really appreciating the information. Thank you very much for being here. Okay, so why don't you each just take, just give us a 1 minute, intro just to say, you know, why at this point are you still doing this? What is on your minds? What is the reason you're spending so much time? You're speaking, you're writing. There's a lot of things you could do with your life and your time. Why are you still doing this? What is on your mind that makes you think it's so important of all the things you could do to be doing what you're doing? Whatever you like.
All right. Is this on? Thank you. Well, first of all, I love it. I think it was Will Rogers who said that the finest day in a man's life is when he falls in love with his work, because then he never has to go to work again. And I think that's kind of where I am. It doesn't feel like a job. And I know this makes me sound like a nerd, but I'd sort of rather read medical journals than go out to dinner sometimes. So I think the other thing is that in my line of work, I get to see people get well. And you never get tired of that. There's just, I'm as excited about the person who gets well today as I was about the person who got well 22 years ago. And I get to learn and grow because more and more people with more and more sicknesses are showing up. As you guys know, health is getting worse instead of better in many ways. I think the other thing that keeps me in the game is I have a big, big, big goal. And that is, I really want to fundamentally change healthcare in this country. And I think the way that it can be done is consumer education. So thank you. So we got to keep showing up here to do this type of stuff, and then we got to charge you guys to go out there and tell everybody. And I know not everybody listens, and I told you guys earlier today, not everybody listens to me either, but people are listening. More and more people are listening. So if we really get together and we make this a collective effort, we can change what's going on right now. So that's why I'm still here.
Well, thank you. Really great to be here. My 1 minute introduction would be kind of exactly the opposite. That is, if we'll be polar opposites that come to the same conclusion. That is, I really don't like doing the job that I'm doing, and that's because I want to be doing healthcare, and I'm doing sick care instead. And it goes on, and we sort of brag about, and you'll hear it in my lecture tomorrow, those of you who can make it, talk about the massive transformation of cardiovascular disease and how well we've done with everything from bypass surgery to statins and the stuff, but we are not getting to the root of the problem. And so my motivation has become very simple, crystallized in the last year, that I'm not stopping until the leading cause of death of cardiologists is no longer heart disease. That. So we really are in an epidemic, and I need every one of you to go to your healthcare practitioners and teach them, because we've done surveys at the American College of Cardiology to prove that doctors know nothing about nutrition. And the other opposite side is everyone's going to tell you what to eat. I'm going to tell you what not to eat, okay, and the data behind that. So thank you very much for having me.
Actually, I'm a little puzzled. I have these things on my ears and this here. I'm not sure which way is that. Why did I have this here?
You can take that out.
Okay, thank you. Good. Yeah, you asked. Oh gosh, sorry about that. I need to eat more plant-based foods. Okay. No, I thought, Steve, when you first asked, you know, why are we still here? I thought you were talking about something like something chronological. And my first impression was, I'm here because I'm eating plant-based foods. No, it's been an education for me, to be honest about it. I didn't, as I already explained, I started out from a very different place, and over the years I continued to be a student. I'm always learning. And one of the things that really energizes me, beyond belief, is that among the lectures I give in various and sundry places, there's always people coming up to me and telling me, sometimes quite privately, that they started this diet and here's what they got. Some people, I don't know, sometimes they give me strange names of diseases I've never heard of before, or strange conditions, and yet they still get this benefit. And when they talk about really life-threatening diseases like cancer especially, and sometimes MS, they tell me these stories sometimes, I say sort of privately, with tears in their eyes. And I just say to myself, I can't stop this. Because when I think about the people who have those problems, and yet they don't know, it really troubles me, because having been in national policy development for as long as I was, and knowing too, you know, why the public is not being made aware of this and should have been made aware of this 100 years ago. You know, that really drives me, just to think that we got some hurdles to get over, but it's been so exciting here in the last just 5 to 10 years, especially, where the whole trajectory of interest, I think, is going up. Very exciting. Thank you.
In 1962, my dad was, who was a general surgeon who established one of the earlier rural group practices that there ever were in upstate New York, was involved when he was so upset with the fact that the elderly were so often destitute and had very little resources with which to pay their medical bills or seek medical help, that when the AMA was totally against us, he was involved with a group of physicians who were actually very much in favor of using resources from Social Security for helping the elderly with their medical bills. And so that was a year after I had finished my internship. And then I noticed when I came back from Vietnam and had been in practice a year or two, I remember talking with my father, and I said, you know, here was the headlines in the New York Times in 1969 that this new program called Medicare was just exploding in its expenses. And I said, well, look, Dad, that program that you were really in favor of seems to be working, but it looks like it's going to be very expensive. This was 1969. And he said something to me that I've never forgotten. He said, you know, the only way we're going to get ahead of this is someday we have got to get smart enough to show people how to live a healthier life. And I guess that really took a while for me to catch on to that, but somewhere halfway through my career is when I got involved. It's a little unusual for general surgeons to be involved with nutrition, but that happened, and the results have been very exciting. And exactly apropos of what Kim Williams just said, I think we in medicine right now collectively almost have to hang our head in recognition of the fact that we have figured out a way to make $1 billion health industry over an illness that does not even exist in half the planet. And we're going to see that that ends. Thank you.
We're going to leave this conference. People are going to be in a good mood. Everyone's going to be feeling confident about what you said. And sometime soon, they're going to speak to someone, and the person is going to say to me, the person's going to say to them, oh yeah, no, I don't follow that. What I do is I follow the zone diet, the South Beach diet, the wheat belly diet, the good calories, bad calories diet, the why we get fat diet, the grain brain diet, the paleo diet, the big fat surprise diet, the new Atkins for a new you. The authors of all these people, of all these books, they seem to have gone to good colleges. And no matter how many times I think momentum has shifted, they come out with a new Atkins paleo diet, and the public seems to be all on board, like it's a good idea. So so again, and as clear as we can, a lot of people think these diets are very good because they seem to lose weight in the short run. What's wrong with these low carb diets? All of them. What's so bad about them? What's the problem with them?
Well, no, pass me the red one.
Oh, the red one.
I want the red one.
Color coordinated.
I'm very disturbed about it too. So supposedly qualified people writing these kinds of books. And I think the first thing is that when people tell me that a diet is great because it works, I lost weight, I tell them, well, there's a lot of things that work for weight loss. Cocaine addiction's really good for that. I mean, seriously, if the only thing we're going to look at is does it work, almost anything will work for a while, as Steve mentioned. I think we have several problems in medicine. I think the first thing, and this is what leads to these kinds of books being written by physicians, is we've lost sight of what the outcome is supposed to be. In other words, the outcome is supposed to be people getting better. And instead, we're paying attention to things like, do you lose weight in 30 days, or does your cholesterol go down in 6 weeks? And we're into the instant fix instead of the long-term outcome. And so if you look at long-term outcomes, a lot of this stuff just doesn't make any sense. There's no proof that it's a good idea in the long term. One thing I'll mention, the wheat belly, this is probably the best one to use as an example. I had an intern in my office, and I had somebody who could help me do this, but we looked up every reference the guy had in his book and archived the studies on our server. We found all but 3. We matched them up with the text, and we found that in most cases, the studies that the guy cited supported our stance, not his, which I thought was interesting. But to tell you what a poorly written book this is, and I think this goes to just how much educating we have to do. On one page in the book, he talks about the problem is that wheat is hybridized. He's against people eating wheat. And so people should eat this einkorn, which is an ancient grain. So he talks about it's hard to find einkorn because you have to wander around southern Italy and the Middle East to find it. So then on the next page, he talks about doing an experiment on himself. I have to share this with you. And the experiment on himself was he called a toll-free number and got some einkorn. This is on the next page from wandering around Italy looking for it. And nobody's proofreading this book. So he made some einkorn bread. He had 2 slices of it, and he was fine. And the next day, he ate some whole wheat bread made from regular wheat. And his brain got foggy, and he was unable to read the medical literature. And my postscript to that is a condition from which he never recovered, apparently. So the problem we have is that medical training needs to change so that medical doctors graduating from school set their sights on using standards of evidence that are pre-established to evaluate information. That's what we do in our office. All studies aren't created equal. All experts are not created equal. You have to have standards. And in every other profession but this one, we have standards. For example, we have standards about who can play football. I'm not allowed. I'm 61 and I weigh 123 pounds, not allowed to play, right? We have standards about who can coach. Nobody is interested in having me coach football. I don't know much about it. We even have standards about who's allowed to talk about football on television. not interested in having me on the panel at ABC Sports talking about how the football game was played. In this profession, everybody's an expert, everybody's equal, all studies are equal, and that simply cannot stay that way, because that is what is causing a lot of these bad messages to gain traction. So I could talk about this forever, but I'll be quiet now. So.
Very well said. The biggest issue that we would like folks to think about, if they're going to change to a ketogenic diet, which a lot of those are, they have to actually look at what it is that they're consuming and what are the downsides and what are the outcomes. Because the outcomes are actually published in peer-reviewed literature. And they would say, and I don't want to take everything away from my talk tomorrow, but one snippet would be that if you are doing you have general health and you sign up for a low carb diet, you increase your mortality over a 5-year period by about 22%. If you happen to do this after a heart attack, it's like a 53% increase. And so losing weight, well, dying is the ultimate weight loss, right? And so when people say, well, what's wrong with it? Well, you're eating animals. And what's wrong with that? Well, there's a bunch of things. I'll cover most of them tomorrow, but there's a few that I had to take out because the talk got too long. But it would be IGF-1, SUPAR, saturated fat, trans fat, cholesterol, TMAO, heme iron, nitrates, and nitrites. And if you could somehow find an animal product that didn't have any of those, well, it wouldn't be an animal product, but at least you wouldn't have things that are known to ruin the health of individuals. So people who are writing books like that don't have a biochemical sense of peer-reviewed literature, and it would be, I think, irresponsible to continue publishing on that, but it's going to take everyone sort of a grassroots approach to change this culture.
I totally agree with you, Dr. Williams, on that question about, returning to science and validating it and getting peer-reviewed, and somehow that's not happening. I think one of the issues here that I've gotten a feeling about has to do with the history of this movement over the years. And if we look back a few decades, it seems to be pretty consistent for some reason. There's a very strong feeling that people have to eat animal foods. They will defend it to the last word, and therefore in opposition to eating plant foods. It's really quite intense. And of course we know too that there's a corporate interest in maintaining that view too, not going to that plant-based diet idea. So it seems to me that many of the books that we talk about, in a sense, are written maybe consciously or unconsciously just about this idea that I don't want to go there. Obviously ketogenic, but that's high protein, that's high fat. We know all the problems with that. But I think it's to some considerable extent intended to be diversionary of what we're talking about here. And talking about low carb diets, for example, without spelling out that, they're really talking about, for which we could have some agreement, they're talking about refined sugar. Whereas they talk about just total carbohydrates, not pointing out the distinction. And since carbohydrate is only produced by plants, in a sense, it's sort of that reaction against what we're saying and saying, oh, here's the problem. It's carbohydrates. Therefore, let's lower carbohydrates. And so that comes into the discussion here too often. And whether maybe in another case, just lectins. Well, lectins are pretty much present in plant-based foods. And so if you look more closely at all these books that are so confusing, written by people who, as you said, Dr. Williams, really don't have the background, haven't published, no experience in nutrition in particular, no research experience. It's just a reaction that's diversionary. It's diversionary from what we're talking about, really.
Well, I think it's all been said. I just would agree with Colin that I think that Steve was addressing the fact that what does the public say when they call us up and say, look at all these other books, which you mentioned. And there's no question, I think, that what I try to tell patients when they're confronted with that challenge of with so many people saying something different, said, why don't you go over and look at the books where the authors, before they wrote the book, have done the research. And that suddenly it begins to narrow down. There's Dr. Dean Ornish. Before he ever wrote the book, he did the research. And then there's another one from Ohio who did the same. The idea is, if you're going to have something valid, the least you can do, as Colin was pointing out, is to really try to do the research first. And the other thing that right now, the challenge that we feel isn't, who are the forces that really oppose what we're coming up with? Well, how about the United States government? Did you ever hear what the USDA food plate or food triangle looks like? If you eat the foods that they put on that triangle, it guarantees that millions of Americans will perish if you follow that. You know, having the USDA make your food pyramid is like having Al Capone do your taxes. Now, there's also industry. Do you suppose that the industry that manufactures chickens wants to go away? How about the statin drug industry? $30 billion a year. Is there a lot of pharmaceutical houses that want to see that go away? And then what about my colleagues? How many physicians who do bypasses and stents are clamoring for fewer and fewer patients? And to me, what's so remarkable, and that's fun about this panel, is that we finally have a cardiologist who, in a leadership position, Kim Williams, as president of the American College of Cardiology, in his presidential address made it very clear about the importance of plant-based nutrition, and he is a very important key member of the nutrition committee of the American College of Cardiology. And I'm very pleased and delighted to be with him on that committee. And what we are trying to do is to sort of turn the behavior of cardiologists around. It's a little bit like, you know, turning the Queen Mary, but I think we're very excited about what can happen.
Earlier this week, Gabriel Cousins was here, and he follows a whole food plant-based diet, mostly a raw whole food plant-based diet, and he agrees with the things that you say in general. One thing he did say that is an outlier from what I normally hear is he was saying that he thinks the average the best cholesterol would be like 159, and that low cholesterols sometimes are associated with depression, and he says that there's not really, and he's completely against eating animal products, but he says among people who are eating plant-based diets that it's better if your cholesterol is a little bit higher. Do you want to comment on cholesterol levels and what they should be, and assuming we're eating a plant-based diet, if it matters? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll start, and then we'll go down. Well, the first thing is that association's not cause and effect relationship. So I use your lines all the time, Dr. Campbell, about phone polls and heart disease and driver's licenses and breast cancer. You know, in countries where there are more phone polls, you have more heart attacks. Well, that doesn't mean phone polls cause heart attacks, right? So the people cite these associations all the time and infer a cause and effect relationship, and that's how bad ideas catch on and become pretty entrenched. Depression, by the way, is not caused by low cholesterol. It's a thinking disorder. And your cholesterol level doesn't affect how you think. That's to be worked out with a psychologist. Furthermore, I think where a lot of this low cholesterol is bad for you came from is studies showing that people with low cholesterol, people diagnosed with cancer have low cholesterol, but we now have a pretty good amount of evidence. I wrote a paper on this that I was able to find 7 or 8 studies supporting it, that when cells become cancerous, they start eating cholesterol. Plasma cholesterol becomes an alternative fuel. And so by the time the cancer is diagnosable, cholesterol levels are very low. So what you have is an association, but it's the opposite. It's not that the low cholesterol causes cancer, it's the cancer causes the very low cholesterol at the time of diagnosis. So I think that there's a problem in jumping to the cause and effect relationship from an association. So I think, having said that, I think ideal cholesterol levels, lower the better. I said this afternoon, my father's IQ is higher than his cholesterol. That's the way we like to keep it. 150 total cholesterol, 80 lower, 80 for LDL. I subscribe to Dr. Esselstyn's recommendations on that, and that's what we strive to do in our office.
That was great answer. So from the cardiology point of view, we've had a little bit of whiplash here. We were doing that $30 billion statin because people talk about their side effects, and I usually tease that the biggest side effect of statins is breaking the Medicare trust fund because people aren't dead. They actually do work. They should be unnecessary, but they do work. Now, the issue that we were concerned about is that if you got and this was just, I'd say, 3 or 4 years ago, if you got the LDL cholesterol, and we'll talk about LDL because when you talk about the total, that would include the good cholesterol, and some people are genetically pre-programmed to have a high cholesterol because their good cholesterol is really high, and then the only way to really talk about their risk is to talk about the bad stuff, the LDL, the stuff that plugs up arteries. So we thought that if your LDL cholesterol got below 25, your brain would fall apart or something like that. And this was just, it was just accepted jargon. Then there was the Dallas Heart Study, and they saw some people, some very few people who had extremely low LDL cholesterol, 7, 14. I said, well, we've got to find out, what are they doing? Are they in mental institutions? No, one's an aerobics instructor, one's a business person. They're normal human beings, and they have no heart disease in their families. So they run the genome, and they find out that they're missing, and this is probably one of just a few such things, but the one that became famous about this story was called PCSK9. How many of you have heard of that? Just a handful, okay. So PCSK9 is a molecule that's responsible for telling your LDL receptors in your liver, it's time for you to quit, you've been out here too long, it's time we're gonna involute you, you're gonna go inside the liver, you're not gonna work anymore. If your PCSK9 is not working, your LDL receptors just keep going, Energizer bunny type stuff. And they pull the cholesterol out of the bloodstream, and your LDL gets extremely low. And it protects your heart and your blood vessels. So it turns out that big industry got wind of this, and they came up with injectable antibodies. For $14,000 a year, you too can get injected twice a month, and your cholesterol will fall incredibly well. And so, vegan diet is a wonderful way. High-dose statin is a great way getting your cholesterol down, but PCSK9 inhibitors are just absolutely fantastic. I do have one patient who's doing all three. His LDL is 3.5. Okay, and so it's, and he's doing fine. And so the question is, why would you want it to ever be that low? Okay, so just last 2 things on it. One is that in development, the babies who are trying to do brain growth and body growth, their LDLs are single digits, and then they get double digits, and then they grow as you start feeding them more animal stuff. So we're not genetically pre-programmed to have these high cholesterols. Number 2 is that if you look at the PCSK9 research, which is getting more and more extensive, one of them called the Glagoff trial, who was named after Seymour Glagoff, my mentor at University of Chicago, who spent all of his career looking at plaque morphology, plaque in arteries, showing that, I'm not going to ask how many people have had an angiogram and been told, oh, you've got a 10% narrowing, you're fine. Well, no, the Glagoff hypothesis is that you actually get remodeling outward. When you put plaque in your arteries, it grows and grows and grows. And it's only when you have so much plaque in there that it can't grow anymore, then it starts to narrow. So by the time you have a 10% narrowing, you have a massive plaque burden. Okay, so that's what he's famous for. And so it's nice to name a trial after him that looked at how, what happens to plaque over time. Now, it wasn't as impressive as what you see with Dr. Esselstyn, but they had a good large population. They could actually make a line. And it turns out for 100% of people to have plaque going away, you need an LDL less than 58, which is close to what we were thinking, oh, it's 70, oh, it's 60, something like that. But the interesting part, defending the idea that as low as possible, is that that line keeps going down. The lower it is, the more plaque regression you get. And so, for your treating a coronary disease, carotid disease, peripheral artery disease population, getting the cholesterol down and keeping it low is a really good idea.
Not being a clinician like my colleagues here, my introduction to the cholesterol world to a great extent was in our China study, which was analyzed chemically, at least in a laboratory, about 1990, so what is that, a quarter of a century ago already. At that time, we wanted to analyze cholesterol, of course. There was a general idea that any cholesterol level below 150 was bad. You know, it was said that suicides are higher. Colon cancer, there was a couple of studies indicating that was possibly higher. And some of that was what Dr. Popper just referred to, you know, the result of the cholesterol going down once diagnosed. But in any case, that was the scenery at the time, the discussion. And so we got cholesterol levels in China, average 127. 127. Bill Castelli was a friend of mine. He's the one who directed the Framingham Heart Study at that time. And even Bill found it really rather remarkable we should have such low levels, but he allowed for it because he thought that might be real. But in any case, the feedback I got at the time from some of my colleagues, you're crazy, the Chinese just, that can't be true. And so, my being skeptical myself, to some extent, we went back and analyzed it by 2 more methods and 2 more different laboratories, and essentially got the same results. So all of a sudden, here we had an average, 127, and a range of means for the counties ranged from 88 total cholesterol to a high of 170. So we were in a new territory. And when we started looking at, you know, what kind of disease rates change throughout that region, it's very clear. Western type of diseases, I mentioned today one of the slides. Western diseases just gradually, as our group came down, the lower and lower the cholesterol. And I know, of course, we get into LDL, HDL discussions, big particles, little particles, all that sort of stuff. And I also have to say, I don't see cholesterol as being, from my definition, as a cause, quite frankly, of disease. It's a really good, on a population-based studies, it's a very good indicator of disease risk, including not just heart disease, but also cancer and some other things. And so I don't know, I think the cholesterol, I think we're getting too much into the weeds, talking about cholesterol in too much detail, because there's one more factor to consider, and that is that we know of people with high cholesterol levels who don't have heart disease, and some people with cholesterol levels, low levels, that do have heart disease. You had that with Joe Crow, your friend. And so we get ranges. And sometimes we worry, I suppose, on an individual level, whether it's good or bad, if we have a 210 or 220, or maybe that's too high. Even 180 is too high for a lot of people. I see it too, in that sense. Cholesterol is just one indicator. It's a good indicator. It's a good indicator for overall diet and disease risk. But I think, yeah, I mean, that's all I can say. It's really, it's that general trend that's so clear. If you look at Western populations at the time we did, starting out from around 300 down to 200, that was the range considered normal in those days. We saw a decrease in heart disease risk, Mr. Fitzgerald and others. But we continued that same range, previously not having an opportunity to see it, going from 170 all the way down to 88. And we saw this remarkable correlation, really highly significant, with Western diseases in China, which weren't all that common. But we saw the same relationship. And so I became really impressed with the idea that cholesterol, we don't necessarily get in danger zones when we're down below 150 at the time. Maybe, I guess we can make some cases, but cholesterol levels too, we know lots of things. But one thing it does have to do with, I'm really convinced, is whether or not we were nursed when we were young. And whether that in turn left an imprint. We published that work in Science, and I'm not sure we talked about that. But incidentally, Dr. Williams, I have a question. If I'm not mistaken, did you say that you said something like statins work? And so I was just talking today, I have to make a comment on this because I offered the possibility that from my analysis of the literature, as I say, not being a cardiologist, that deaths, coronary deaths, are not really lowered to any significant extent by statins. The best I could find was about a 9% reduction in deaths. And sure, it's true. Statins, lower cholesterol, I agree with you. But whether that translates into lower mortality rates, if you will. Okay, we'll have to talk about that some because I need to get caught up to date on that.
No problem. Easy to Google. I'll show you.
This is a interesting story. It's hard for me to really figure out how, when patients call me and they say they can't get their cholesterol down, they can't take any statin drugs because they're so allergic to them, they can't get their cholesterol under 180, 190, or 200, but no number has ever caused heart disease. What causes heart disease is what is passing through your lips every day that is going to absolutely destroy the capacity of your endothelial cells to make an adequate quantity of the life jacket of your blood vessel, which is your nitric oxide level. And as you begin decade after decade eating the horrible Western diet, and as your level of nitric oxide falls and falls, you start making these plaques when you're 12 years old, you make more when you're in teenage, not enough for your events, and now you're into your 40s, you're still eating the same way, and you've got enough plaque that you have this disease. But we found that when we got patients to totally stop any food morsels through their lips that were going to injure their endothelium, not only does it stop injuring, it's the endothelium, but the endothelium begins to recover, and it makes enough nitric oxide that your disease is halted. And often you can get evidence of disease reversal. And I just would sort of feel, I would so much rather have everybody begin to eat correctly rather than to have everybody be on a drug, because these drugs do have side effects. And that we have any number of patients who simply cannot take any of these statin drugs. They are in no way precluded from enjoying the benefits of whole food plant-based nutrition when they do it correctly. There's a fascinating study that just came out in the American Journal of Cardiology, which we get automatically when we become a member. And it had to do with these 1,200 people in Spain. They had absolutely normal risk factors across the board, 1,200, okay? Then they carefully studied them. They did carotid ultrasound, calcium score of the heart, ultrasound in the infrarenal aorta, ultrasound in the iliofemoral region. 49% of those people have cardiovascular disease. So, here they are getting all the right numbers that we would want them to have, and half of them have already started forming this disease. There's another study that has been so fascinating to me, which is called CANTOS. And I mentioned it to you today when I spoke earlier this morning. And CANTOS was using a very, very powerful anti-immune drug, canakinumab. And the fascinating thing was, in the group that responded and had fewer cardiac events, they did not even budge their LDL cholesterol. So it comes back that inflammation is probably much more powerful than we ever thought before. And guess what is a lot safer and less expensive than canakinumab? Plant-based nutrition. And it's very powerful for lowering cholesterol, and it's very powerful for getting rid of inflammation. And I think that's the way we got to go.
If someone's a 54-year-old male, they are thin, they feel great, and they eat animal products every meal, would you recommend that they be on a statin drug? What are the pros and cons of statin drugs, and do they help prevent deadly heart attacks and strokes?
So yeah, let's go back to it again. Yeah, and just to talk, showing Dr. Campbell, you just Google the words mortality, statin use, and you'll see that the placebo group lost every trial except one. That was ALHAT, and that's because it was open label, and the doctor saw the cholesterol was high, and they put them on statins, so at a high frequency. So every true placebo-controlled trial, you couldn't get it one past an investigational review board. The data is so strong. So where can we really believe them? Because a lot of us, many of us up here, and probably some in the audience, have a little skepticism when it comes to pharmaceutical sponsored trials where they have a vested interest in the outcome. So there's one trial that didn't have that. It was the TNT trial called Treat to New Targets. It was low-dose Lipitor versus high-dose Lipitor. They weren't going to make them a penny more because they were charging the same for the 10 milligram and the 80 milligram. That was about a 18% decrease in heart attack, stroke, and death in the high dose, okay? Now, the reason to mention it, because I really want to double down on what Dr. Esselstyn is saying, is that, you know, we're giving these drugs expecting that everybody's going to take them, and it's just not true. So in that particular trial, they said, oh, the symptoms, and it's usually muscle soreness, are just not that frequent. And it's not that dose related. It's more like 8% versus 8.5% in the high dose. So you'll be fine. Well, the way you get a low number like that is you do a run-in period, okay? So you ask people will they participate, you give them the drug for 3 weeks, and if they tolerate it, you're enrolled in the trial. If you don't tolerate it, you're out. Well, okay, that is actually is done with every trial for toxicity, for safety. You do a run-in period. So it's standard methodology, but you can't use that in your office and say, oh, it's 8%. So being a person who's treating a lot of disease and a lot of people who are refractory to changing their diet, no matter what I do and say, which is a handful, but they're still there. And then people who genetically have so much LDL cholesterol, they've got the xanthomas and the knuckles with the big cholesterol deposits. You need all hands on deck for everyone like that. So we do end up using a lot of statins, and the higher the dose, the lower the event rate. And so there are going to be people who really need them, but it shouldn't be $30 billion. It shouldn't be the majority of Americans, because most of the people can do it with lifestyle. And so we had, you know, somewhat controversial guidelines come out in 2013 where we said we're not just treating the LDL cholesterol anymore, we're going to treat the risk. And so maybe many of you may have the app for your phone for the ACC's risk calculator, and it said, oh, well, we're just going to increase the number of statins used. No, I was actually taking people off, because if they had an LDL greater than 130, I was taught that I was supposed to put them on the drug. But if they have no hypertension, they are not a smoker, you put all of the risk factors in, and they come out 5%. I took them off the statin, okay, and see if they can maintain that. And so we have learned a lot over the years. Statins, I believe, have their rightful place, but if everyone was a thin, walking, everyday vegetarian, we would not be needing this big pharmacopoeia of drugs, including statins. So I would say they're not as dangerous as people say they are. They're not as safe either, as the other side would tell you. They are not necessary for most people, but you know, we've got to get our population a long way educationally in terms of lifestyle for us to be able to decrease their use.
I think that's enough.
Sure.
Do you want us all to talk about it?
No, only if someone has something to say.
Yeah. I think Kim said it all.
Okay.
Can I?
Sure.
I have to make a comment here. This is kind of fun. I like the debate, but it's in a sense, Dr. Williams just showed me some evidence supporting what he said before that I tended not to agree with, that mortality is reduced. I see this data here. It's quite impressive. What study was that, and where?
So I literally just did put in statin reduction mortality. I just put those into Google and went to images so you can see Kaplan-Meier plots. Those are the little survival plots. And you see a massive number of them. There's just trial after trial after trial of a reduction, including the one that I talked about, low dose versus high dose. You have, and a lot of people are still using, I hate to do trade names, but Zocor. When that lost every single trial. And so you have 2 of them that are really powerful and 5 that are not. And using the ones that are weaker have a weaker outcome. And so they're all 20%. And every population, probably one of the most insightful ones was another one that looked at just taking your diabetic. It's interesting that if you look at the Nurses' Health Study, and I'll talk about this one tomorrow, and talk about what causes nurses to die? And they've got all of the risk factors, and they collect all this data. We would have thought that smoking would be the #1 thing. Smoking came in third. #1 was getting older, okay? #2 was diabetes. And so this epidemic of obesity, which creates diabetes, particularly central obesity, is really running havoc. Well, believe it or not, we have drugs that can take a diabetic who's otherwise asymptomatic and no other risk factors and lower the cardiac event rate by 22%, and that's just a low-dose Lipitor. Now again, I would say they're great drugs. I'm not a fan of them because it's unnecessary. The diabetes is accumulating because of the central obesity, and if you get that to go away, you don't need the drugs, you don't need insulin and all those things. They're actually increasing plaque by the moment, and the folks are really at high risk, and we have to actually do this as a population, not just with drugs. So anyway. So I'm agreeing with you for the wrong reason. There is data, but we still shouldn't be using them. We shouldn't have to. Okay.
Just one more follow-up on that. I do recall two things. One, I thought that I've read that statins are connected with increase in diabetes, and I also remember a Business Week article like 12 years ago saying with all this statins, they are lowering cholesterol, but they're almost not even lowering deaths at all, which is the real goal. So, and that was...
So that was... We're live? And so that's the part. The second part is what we were just talking about. Just Google those 3 words and you'll see all these, just massive numbers of studies where people have spent a lot of time and effort. A lot of it is pharmaceutical industry, but they still have shown that heart attack, stroke, and death. Probably the one where we were more shocked recently, if I had to pick out a highlight, was the HOPE-3 trial, where you might have heard of the poly pill, where they put a statin in with a antihypertensive, and they gave it to people with one risk factor, and then they jumbled all the data up. So you had sort of 4 quadrant. You had the fake pill, completely fake. You had the fake statin, the fake antihypertensive, and the people who were on both. And then you could divide it into 2 halves and in 2 ways, and see what the results were. There was a lot of good data, and it did what you thought it would do. It would decrease events. But the shocker was the effect of statins on stroke in the people who were randomized to not get the antihypertensive and their blood pressure was averaging 140, 150. If they were on a statin, they could tolerate that blood pressure with almost a 50% reduction in strokes. So they really have a role. I'm just, again, saying I'm not against them. I'm against the fact that we have to use them, because it really shouldn't exist.
Were any of those studies done with plant-based nutrition? No. So, that way,
An entire industry that's totally unnecessary. That you've been saying this for years. And so we have unnecessary diseases being treated with unnecessary medicines, but they do work. Seatbelts work. If you have all automated cars and there are no mistakes, you don't need seatbelts. But right now, we do need them.
Can I add a comment here about your reference to the poly pill?
Yes.
I find that one of the most troublesome words I've seen in recent years. Yeah. We're talking about poly pills. My God, if one doesn't work, one drug doesn't work, let's try 2, 3, whatever.
Right.
Is what in a general sense, for the public to even discuss the possibility that we might be working toward developing poly pills,
right, troubles
me, because that really sort of conveys the message. Okay, we can live by drugs. We're going to have one sooner or later.
Right.
And instead of talking about the real thing that matters.
Can I double down on that? So the whole idea of the poly pill is that's something you would not do in the United States. That is, people expect individualized care. You don't say, oh, you've got a risk factor, we're going to throw this pill at you. But in third world countries, that shouldn't even have high blood pressure and high cholesterol and diabetes. They're getting it because they're westernizing. They're having our franchises on their corners, and they're incentivized to do it because it's cheap food. They are ruining their lifestyle, losing their agrarian society, and doing less exercise, sitting in a chair. And so now they can't afford the drug costs that we have here. And so you just take this large population of people who are all of a sudden cardiovascular disease is #1, and you throw poly pills at them, and they actually work. But but again, I can say it. This goes on. I'm probably going to say it 50 times. These are totally unnecessary. You shouldn't need a poly pill. But does it work? Yeah, it does.
Okay. What are the health? You've been clear about eating a whole food plant-based diet, but would it be such a big deal if we just ate eggs? Maybe we had an egg every morning. Or, is that a big deal? Is that like beef and chicken and cheese and fish? Like, is eggs okay?
So to turn a phrase, and I don't want to steal everything from my presentation tomorrow, but I would say, what came worse, the chicken or the egg? Okay. Okay. So as it turns out, I think a lot of us were shocked to find that you could have a substance with 0 cholesterol, not saturated fat, and that would be egg whites. And that somehow would be impugning health because we thought that the egg yolk had all the cholesterol and that was leading to plaque, et cetera. So a couple of articles. One talked about IGF-1, which is associated with development of diabetes, cancer, heart attack, stroke, death. Actually does occur with any kind of animal protein. And so having a concentration of animal protein, and the protein is not that great in egg whites anyway, but I'm not going to give away the quiz questions for tomorrow about how much it is. But then the other side of it was in 2016, and I will go over this tomorrow in detail because you have to have this emblazed in your brain, the graph that talks about hazard ratio of animal versus vegetable and which type of death, that is other, cancer, heart disease, or all-cause, which one of them is not associated with increased death? And the only answer was dairy causing cancer. Now, some people would argue with that. Well, just do another study with another few 100,000 patients followed for a long period of time, and you could refute that. But as most of you know, red meat kills. Processed red meat kills you faster. And it's actually been on the World Health Organization's carcinogen list, okay, processed red meat. Well, it turns out that in that study, eggs caused more cancer than processed red meat. So I hope everybody sees that. I always tease, and I try not to say it again tomorrow, that it was published in a vegan propaganda journal. Now, it was Journal of American Medical Association, so it's very well peer-reviewed, very large study. It was nurses' health and physician health to put together. And so this data is actually very convincing that no one should eat any animal product whatsoever unless you are immune from heart disease and other kinds of death, and then you should eat dairy. Yeah, okay.
We were just chatting, S and I, on it.
Was that in October of 2015? Where eggs are worse than the red meat, because they put it in the same category of carcinogenicity as smoking. Yeah, eggs are in the same level of carcinogenicity as smoking.
About 20 years ago, I had to go back and actually collect these data again and find these papers. But I recall when I wrote a brief review on this some years ago, 4 studies showing that eggs were significantly associated with increased risk for colon cancer in particular. That was some years ago. Quite striking, actually.
Can I make one more comment on this? Because I did spend a fair amount of my presidency fighting this issue. It was mind-boggling that the 2015 dietary guidelines for the United States came out, and they said that cholesterol was no longer a nutrient of concern. You could eat as much as you want. And the references were 2. One was our guidelines, American College of Cardiology, American Heart Association, which was completely not true. It was a complete misrepresentation, them quoting us saying that, that eggs were not associated with any adverse outcome. What we were actually saying is that we need modern studies that look specifically at cholesterol ingestion and the effect on cholesterol. Well, it turns out that even that was misguided again, and it had missed a few things, and I've sent it all to Bob Eckel, and they would never say that again. But even so, it was misquoted. The other one was even more interesting. It was a study, a meta-analysis, by meaning that they took a whole bunch of studies and put them together. And you had to have one of these two criteria, that is a population with less than that 1 or 0 eggs per week versus 7 or more eggs per week. And if you followed those people for 5 years, you didn't see much in the way of heart disease. So they concluded that it was fine. And of course, anybody in the room would include that. I think we want people to live more than 5 years. Okay. So anyway, that was the beginning of the abstract. Apparently the people who put together your United States guidelines did not read the rest of the abstract, where it said that if you are eating these regularly, it increases your diabetes rate by about 42%. But if you were a diabetic, it increased your cardiovascular disease rate by 69%. And how they could ignore that and say, it's mind-boggling, except for one thing. The committee was apparently infiltrated by the Egg Board. And that's a hard thing to fight, but we did fight it. Multiple meetings with USDA, went to Health and Human Services, went to the FDA, went to everyone who would listen with our message, with a lot of help from Neil Barnard, who's actually there in Washington, D.C. And we got it changed. And so the guidelines did come out with the statement. That's right. That's right. It now quotes the Institute of Medicine, another vegan propaganda group? No, this is the Institute of Medicine. And it's the statement from their 2001 publication says people should eat as little cholesterol as possible, which of course is 0, which means everybody should be a vegan.
Use the microphone.
Why is the USDA the one that's given the responsibility to make the food plate or the food pyramid? Because everybody in the USDA was an officer in the cattle industry, the pork board, the egg board, the Dairymen's Association. That doesn't work.
You would think that they're interested in food, but the Department of Agriculture, that's the branch that is tasked with this, they alternate. They work on it each time, but they alternate who's in charge, Health and Human Services versus the USDA. And so, you know, they were actually very receptive, and they listened, and ultimately did make the change, but you had to bring them a massive amount of literature.
Why do we always have to listen to the Institute of Medicine, by the way? Because in 2002, when those dietary guidelines came out at that time, they came to the range idea. Instead of just RDAs or RDIs, if you will, they started developing ranges. A little bit before that, but using ranges. So the range said to be safe for protein consumption as a percent of total calories. Okay. Went up to 35%. In other words, it's safe to consume a diet, mostly from animal foods, with a range of protein intake up to 35%. And it so happens the chairman of that board at the time was the most significant consultant for the dairy industry in the world.
Wow.
And so that has caused so much mischief. Institute of Medicine, and I've been on those panels too myself. And so I would argue that, maybe going back to what you had said, Hess, that some of these government bodies, you know, who sort of establish guidelines, if you will, they're not all right.
Yep.
And so I'm really troubled by what the Institute of Medicine has done over the years.
Oh, I agree. We shouldn't have to go and have multiple meetings to get something fixed that's evidence-based. You know, and that old saying, you know, never attribute to malice what's easily attributable to ignorance, okay? But that only goes so far in this area. This area is what's attributable to money. And the financial interests are run very deep, and it's very difficult to go up against them, but we have to keep going.
So the next question is, if we could go back in a time machine 200 years and go to the deepest, most pristine waters in the world, and someone with a rowboat would go and get a fish himself and take that fish out and cook it himself, is so no mercury, nothing in the dirty in the water, in that case, would it be okay to eat fish?
There you go again. You got the animal protein, okay? And when you look, I don't know if you saw it because it was on the slide this morning. Remember how important it is about the research on for the omnivores who are eating meat, they have bacteria in their microbiome that have the capacity to make lecithin and carnitine turn into TMAO, which devastates and injure your blood vessels. So that's going to happen. And remember, the bottom line on that slide said that which particular animal protein raises your TMA higher than any? Fish.
I'll just maybe dissent a tiny little bit and say this. I think that one thing we know is that the effect is dose dependent. And here's my concern about all of this. There really isn't an indigenous vegan population on the planet. And we all cite statistics for places like Okinawa and Papua New Guinea and places like this where it's a plant-based diet, it's a starchy plant-based diet, and very tiny amount of calories from animal protein. And so I think we have to acknowledge that, and I'll come back to your question in a minute, Steve. I think we have to acknowledge that very small amounts of animal food in the diet appear to be tolerable by humans. And one of the ways I think that we can get more people to do this is not being so caught up with the V word. Now, having said that, the patients who you deal with, I've seen your program at Cleveland Clinic, and I don't think there's any level of restriction that you could give these people that would be inappropriate because of how sick they are. I'm serious. I mean, I recommend your diet to people who are in that condition. But I think we run the risk of taking people who are younger and not sick and making them think that this is a diet for people who are very sick because it is so restrictive. So that's why we don't take animal foods entirely off the table for a significant number of our people, but we're very clear that it has got to be a tiny little bit of animal food. I mean, a woman in Ethiopia fixing dinner tonight takes 8 ounces of goat and slices it up and feeds 9 people. And that's simply not dangerous as far as we know. But it has to be, as I said this afternoon, prescriptive. In other words, it's 2 or 3 times a week, it's organic, it's wild caught, and it's, and it's not any more than 2 or 3 times a week. So the answer to your question, Steve, in my opinion, is if that fish was being consumed a couple times a week, probably not a problem. If it's being consumed for breakfast, and then there's a cheeseburger for lunch, and there's pizza at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and a steak at dinner, the collection of all of that is highly toxic. So I think it's not, everybody wants to get carried away with the quality of the animal food. And I think there's some issues with the quality of the animal food. I think we should pay attention to it. But I think that the quality of the animal food discussion leads people to think that if it's better animal food, then you can have a lot of it. And that's simply not true. And then the other discussion ends up being, well, if it's fish and chicken, is that better than beef and pork? Not if you're eating the same amount of it. It's only when whatever it is that you're eating, with the exception of dairy, in my opinion, that you ratchet it down to a teeny, teeny part of your diet, assuming you're in relatively good health, that you're going to get any therapeutic effect. So I think that we have to stop having a discussion about pasture-fed beef and all that. That leads people to thinking that there's some magical way they're somehow going to be able to hang on to all this animal food in their diet, and I think the evidence is quite clear that they can't.
Well, again, I think earlier in your talk, you have to answer what to everybody is a little bit. What is moderate? What is, when you start having, I mean, just in this group who are here, ask them what moderate would be.
Well, we don't use that term. We do not use the term moderation. We don't use.
No, I thought you were talking about a little bit or something at breakfast.
No. I'm talking about a little bit, but our language about it is very specific. It's 2 or 3 times a week, and the English translation of that, in case anybody's really confused.
So that's 156 times out of the year.
Right. That's exactly right.
That you're injuring your endothelial cells.
Well, yes, but I'm going to tell you something. Here's the thing. Sometimes I have a glass of wine, it probably injures my brain cells, and this afternoon I had a cup of coffee. And I I have acrylic nails, and that's probably not good, and we have no idea what color my hair is. I'm telling you right now. We don't want to know. All right. So the point is that if what we're suggesting to people is that you should not ever do anything that causes any injury to any part of your body at any time. I wouldn't have gotten on the plane this morning. I wouldn't have driven to the airport. I'd take off the nails. We'd see whatever color my hair is. I'm sure the makeup is toxic, and I had birthday cake at the last party I went to, and I'm sure that was not good for me. So I think that, and I think that the problem with this type of a message is that like I said, if somebody has coronary artery disease and had a heart attack, all on board, no level of restriction that's too much. But I think we have to be careful about this message, because if we can't sell it to people, we're done. All right? And if we don't reach anybody, if what we're reaching is a tiny part of the population, and so another thing, and I said this afternoon I'm controversial, so we might as well just go there now. So here's the thing. We get excited about things. We get excited about restaurants serving plant-based fare. We get excited every time a celebrity has a vegan meal. Okay, but we have got to start getting excited because we see the needle moving in terms of numbers of people in the population. We are converting to thinking that taking care of themselves is better, with diet and lifestyle, is better than taking drugs. And it's a slow slog right now. We've got to gather steam. And one of the ways we've got to do it, in my opinion, is we've got to present something that people are willing to buy. The science of change is as rich as the science of plant-based nutrition or nutrition in general. And the two reasons why people make a change in anything, diet or otherwise: number one, I think it will benefit me. Number two, I can see myself doing it. I can show you study after study after study after study, dozens upon dozens upon dozens, research as deep as Colin Campbell's. Here's where we're losing them. I can see myself doing it. Okay? We have to be careful about that. So that's one of the reasons why Steve said when he introduced me, why we sort of stay away from the V word. I'm vegan. I love it. I'm proud of it. I tell everybody. I don't hide that. But having said that, I'm not sure that that is the message that's going to change the world for us.
Yeah. I think some of this discussion that we're having here is really interesting in the sense that, we've been caught up so much in making indefinite statements, especially in reference to quantitative amounts of this, that, or something else, setting ranges, putting in boundaries here and there, and tailoring our messages to specific numbers far too much. And so you're good here, you're bad there if you're just barely bad, kind of thing. That's one issue. The other issue is, too, I've been asked this question many times: do you have to be 100% whole food plant-based to really get the benefits you're talking about? And what's the evidence for it? Well, when I look at that question, I can't defend being 100% whole food plant-based diet for everybody all the time. I really can't. But looking at the data, on the other hand, the message I'd rather like is to say that's the goal. I like to talk about it as a goal. And then honor the steps that everybody takes toward that goal without getting too much caught up into the real details. Now, there are other issues like Dr. Esselstyn's work, where he was really working with seriously ill patients. You really wanted to be thorough. And that's a message should be taken too. Somebody has a serious problem, say, hey, I advise you go the whole way. But it gets me out of the business when I take that position of having to defend the idea that, I know there's smokers live to be 95 and claim they got to be 95 because they were smoking. That kind of thing. And so, we have these variations in evidence and variations this and that. And so I said, that's the goal. I will defend that, because the question I then asked, does anyone know of any serious illnesses occurring with people who are consuming 100% whole food plant-based diets? Do you know of any evidence that people going 100% of the way, they're actually suffered illnesses? Do you know one?
Yeah, happened to my mom. So the bottom line is, don't do a raw vegan diet and restrict it to a handful of items without checking the amino acid content first. She ended up with hypoalbuminemia, low protein C and protein S, pulmonary embolism. And all she had to do is just ditch the almonds a couple times a week and add Brazil nuts. If you just Google it for amino acid content, you find that almonds are missing 3, leucine, lysine, and methionine. And all the other nuts that will complement that. So it is possible to go nuts okay, with a completely plant. And then she's a raw vegan. But as far as I know, that's the only person in the entire planet who's ever had that happen. But that's a good warning.
Yeah, but totally raw is such an unsafe way to eat. Yeah, because you can't get your nutrients.
one thing I'll add is I just want to make it clear. I don't think we all disagree very much on this, really. I think we're all pretty much on the same page. The variation sometimes, I think, comes in the population that you're dealing with. I deal with the general public. All right, so people are coming into my office who are 30 years old and they don't have a health problem. Or they're coming in and they're 35 years old and they need to lose 10 pounds because of their last pregnancy. And those are all things, I mean, these are people that are being proactive about their health and we want to pay attention to it. But having said that, this is a difficult audience to impose extreme restriction on. And my fear is, and we've had some experience with this, because when I started my business, I was, first of all, backing up, I'm an off the deep end kind of person. I don't do anything halfway. Okay? When I smoke cigarettes, I smoke 4 packs a day, because if you're going to smoke, you ought to smoke. All right? This business of one here and there, never been my style. Took up running. My first race was a marathon. Right? So this is the way I do things. Right? So I read about this diet. I jumped off the cliff. It's like, okay, I'm going to be a vegan now, and I never, so that's what I did. And I did it all wrong in the beginning, but the point is that's my personality. So I opened a company. I think I got confused, and I thought I was starting a company called I Want to Be Like Pam, which that wasn't it. I mean, that was the idea, I think, in the beginning, and then I realized this can't be I Want to Be Like Pam. This really has to be, what do we have to say to people, and what do we have to present to people to get a lot of people on board so that we can make this work? And so I backed off of the perfectionism because of the audience that I was serving, which was the general public. And I think that's where you see some of the differences in approaches, and I think they're all valid. And I think we need to honor that and look at the places where we agree, which is 99.5% of all of it. So I don't want people to walk away from this saying these people are all confused and can't agree with each other, because I don't think that that would be an accurate statement to make.
Just one tiny comment. So, we'll talk a lot tomorrow about sugar, and the thing that really caught our attention once the Sugar Research Foundation got out of the way, going back to my earlier point, was an article, again, in Journal of the American Medical Association that showed the curvilinear relationship between added sugar and mortality. And that's what we need to solve this discussion. That is that we know there's a dose response. We don't know whether it's curvilinear, we don't know if it's perfectly linear, and we don't know where is it that it's safe. Well, it turns out on that one, you cannot see the difference between 8%, 7.6. You can't be seeing less than 8% of ingested sugar for your calories on that mortality curve. Now, does that mean that we should all be eating 0? Well, I'm kind of like you. So yeah, I dumped it completely. But that curve really did give us a sort of a warning label above 8%. And so I would say at some point, it would be great to have enough data sets to be able to say, yeah, is it the Somalis who catch whatever they can, and they're in Bolivia. You have the Okinawans who eat 3 to 4 ounces, 3 to 4 times a month of animal products, and that's it. Maybe that is toxic, and maybe they'd live to 120 instead of 105. I don't know. It would be great to have that kind of data, but that would be an aspirational target.
So in terms of one thing, Dr. Esselstyn, that you seem a little bit different than others is on the subject of fats. So when we're talking about nuts and seeds means chia, flax, sesame, sunflower, pumpkin, hemp. When we're talking about olives, when we're talking about avocados, and then when we're talking about oil. It seems like a lot of the whole food plant-based authors seem to be more flexible. They seem to be okay on seeds, okay on avocados, not sure about olives. So maybe, do you have a different position on fats than actual oils? Or what is your thoughts on seeds first, then nuts, then avocados, then olives, and then the actual oils, which you have indicated concern you? Get a microphone.
The whole idea that we sort of started with in our study on trying to halt and reverse heart disease was I was just simply sort of mimicking those cultures where cardiovascular disease is virtually non-existent. So that immediately kind of got rid of all the oils, which, oil, what do oils have? Do they have minerals? No. Do they have vitamins? Maybe a tiny little vitamin E. And do they have fiber? No. What do they have? They have calories. They have fat, 120 calories per tablespoon. And very few of my patients who were seriously ill with heart disease needed fat. And now we have about 8 or 10 really wonderful peer-reviewed studies showing that with these oils, the oils, whether it's Lawrence Rudell's work, whether it's Robert Vogel's work, whether it's the work of Christian Estrada, whether it's any number of authors have clearly shown how injurious these oils are to the endothelial cells. That's my prize. That's the guys that I'm trying to save. So that wiped out the oils. Then we took away the meat because the meat was injuring endothelial cells. There's a lot more fat. So you get rid of the oils, you get rid of the meat. And then the dairy was equally culpable. So we got rid of the dairy. Now you've gotten rid of a lot of fat, but when we carefully study these patients with diet diaries and through the dietary computer mechanisms, we found that our patients were consuming a diet of about 11%, 11% fat. They had no fat insufficiencies. The lowest ingestion of fat I've ever heard of was the Japanese soldiers in World War II. It was something like 3.5%, but they had no nutritional deficiencies in terms of fat. Now, I would agree to being a bit of an outlier on the nuts and seeds. Now, it's very clear in my book, I think it's page 70. That I have no problems with people who don't have heart disease eating nuts and seeds. But here's my problem. I know that there have been a number of studies out there clearly showing in recent, within the last probably decade and a half, that there seems to be always in a comparison group, that the group on nuts seemed to be getting their heart disease more slowly. That wasn't as high a percentage. But that, you have to understand that I am very competitive for my patients, and I hate failure. And so, to me, slowing the rate of heart disease is not the goal. And a couple of points about nuts. How many people do you know who will ever eat one nut? Nuts are highly addicting. And also there's this problem that I have, that many of these studies that have come out were funded by the nut companies. And then there's the other problem that I have yet to see a single study where patients are seriously ill with heart disease, where you give them peanut butter, where you give them nuts, and where you give them cashew sauce, and you see their disease halt and evaporate and go away. So this is why I'm so adamant about this, because I see nuts as sort of working against me in terms of compiling the nutrients that are going to injure the endothelial cells. So when I see that study that shows that you can give these patients seriously ill with heart disease, you can give them all these nuts, then I will stand corrected. But in the meantime, right now, we have got data that we will compete with anybody on the planet with our patients who do what we ask them to do. And if I am proved wrong, I will not have hurt my patients. Does that answer you? Yeah.
You wrote a book, Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease, and I think a lot of us feel that when you say that heart disease, we can totally have control over that by eating a whole food plant-based diet. A lot of us feel comforted by that. But we're also really concerned about cancer and Alzheimer's. And if you want to throw in multiple sclerosis and Lou Gehrig's disease, those 4 terrorizing diseases, nightmares, what could we do? You know, it's so great that we could feel like we have control of a heart disease that kills 1/3 of the people. That's so great. But what could we do to prevent Alzheimer's and cancer and maybe even MS and like Lou Gehrig's? What could we do?
Well, it's interesting that as you get involved in this, and over the last 30 years, I've suddenly begun to rub elbows and shoulders with other persons who are quite interested in this. And suddenly out of the woodwork, you begin to seeing these isolated cases that are not quite as isolated as I thought before. That I have not seen yet a peer-reviewed study, for instance, of Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, comparing those that were plant-based with those that were eating the regular diet. I've not seen that with rheumatoid arthritis and lupus and multiple sclerosis. But I have seen time after time after time patients who were absolutely riddled with these diseases where I've had, granted it's often an anecdotal report, but now it's gotten to the point where I have met personally 3 women, all of them cardiologists. One is making a movie, Code Blue. Sarai Stancic. When she was in her residency one day at 2 o'clock in the morning, she could not move her legs. She had an attack of multiple sclerosis. But she finished her residency on a cane, having the usual medications. Then finally went plant-based. She's now running half marathons. And you know, she had all the diagnosis was not in question. But she did not have apparently I'm not an expert on multiple sclerosis yet, but there's this progressive disease which none of these 3 people have had, but they had this intermittent relapsing, and she's now been 7 or 8 years, so it's really quite clear that she's found an answer there. The other was, interestingly enough, is a cardiologist from the Brigham Hospital at Harvard, and she was kind enough to write me an email because she was interested in plant-based research, and she was the one that was responsible for my invitation to speak at Harvard last month at give grand rounds at the Brigham, which was very exciting because they are 3 young cardiologists at Harvard who now they've had the Kool-Aid. They are very excited about plant-based nutrition. But she herself, during her residency, suddenly was blind in one eye. And when they got the MRI of the brain lesion, sure enough, she had multiple sclerosis. But her lesions have stayed stable. She totally went plant-based. And these are very sophisticated consumers. And the other is a member of our nutrition committee, Monica Agarwal, who had rheumatoid arthritis in her, she was quite crippled with this, but totally turned it around. So I can't give you a string of peer-reviewed studies on this, but I have to say that I think the evidence is rapidly accumulating that just as Pam carefully sort of individualized many of her patients, I think we will be able to do the same thing with many of these autoimmune diseases. And these are absolutely crippling diseases, but it's so apparent. And I told you this morning what makes me so passionate about medicine now more than perhaps even when I was a surgeon is the fact that we're on the cusp of what would be a seismic revolution in health, which will only come about when we have the will to show the public the lifestyle, and most specifically, when we teach them the nutritional literacy that is going to empower them to be the locus of control to annihilate chronic illness.
Well, thank you. I said this afternoon, I don't know if you were in the room when I said it, but it would be great if we had Esselstyn type studies on multiple sclerosis and autoimmune and everything. And I'm hoping one day that we'll have that. But you know, it's interesting when I started looking into, as I showed this afternoon, the evidence for using a plant-based diet for these diseases, what you see, and you have to really spend time trying to connect all these dots, is you see a lot of reductionist studies where this one limits fat and that one limits 1 food or 2 food, or people self-report, like for rheumatoid arthritis. I eliminated this food and it made me feel better. But what starts to emerge when you see this again and again and again, just like you're meeting people, you meet one person and it's an interesting story, but by the time you meet the 3rd or 4th person, and if they're medical professionals who are saying, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and I changed to this diet and I got better, well, by the time you heard the 3rd and 4th one, you're starting to put some more credence to it. And so that's what I think is in the medical literature now. I was even able to find a study that was done in Japan with patients who were put on a plant-based, not vegan, but plant-based diet, who had Crohn's disease, and the patients who stuck with it did not relapse. And it wasn't even a perfect diet, but they didn't relapse. So I think we're seeing lots of clues in the medical journals. And one of the reasons I keep bringing this up is because people say we need more research, and we do need more research. But the we need more research is somewhat an excuse not to jump on board with this, which I do not want to tolerate. Because if we are willing to work hard enough to look at, I mean, I told you, I've archived a couple thousand studies on autoimmune diseases, and again as many on specifically Crohn's and colitis, and a very clear picture starts to come through, which is that when you eat a diet high in animal foods and fat and junk food and processed carbohydrate, you increase your risk of developing these diseases, and people who stop that get better. And even when they just stop one or two bad habits, they don't get all the way better, but there's improvement, which means that if you took all the things that people have done that have made them better and you do all of that to somebody, okay, let's get rid of the fat, let's get rid of the animal food, let's get rid of the dairy, and all that, you get spectacular results. And that's how we've managed to show our people what to do and get them to go along, because we could show them that evidence. So.
What is academic freedom, and is it getting better or worse, and why does academic freedom matter?
Well, having been an academic all my life, I guess, I've become acutely aware of a problem, namely academic freedom. When I was a graduate student, it seemed to be, to the extent that we ever thought about it, that most faculty were in fact free to say what they wanted to say, and they had academic freedom because they had tenure. So that was in the late 50s, early 60s. It seemed like, at least to us, most professors were, at least 90% were either tenured already or were on tenure tracks. And then now, I want to mention a couple of specific estimates that were made and published. In 1980, it had dropped to 70%. 70% of faculty were tenured, or on tenured actually, tenure or tenure track. In 2010, 30 years later, it had dropped to 30%. The most recent data I got, just prior to this meeting, only 9% of academics these days, 9% are actually tenured. 30% are on tenure tracks, but that doesn't mean tenure, because they're still vulnerable. So now there's only 1 out of every 11 academics that's actually tenured. I was fortunate, I got tenure at a very young age, and so it's one of the reasons I guess I turned out to jump off the ship sometimes. But in any case, I'm really deeply concerned about this, because as tenure has declined, it's very dramatic, and I think it's almost going to disappear. I know there's problems with tenure, by the way. People could be tenured and sort of sit there and do nothing, and so the story goes. But the decline in tenure in this country now is very serious, and I have to tell you, knowing my colleagues as I do, there's a lot of colleagues, for example, that I'm inclined to agree with what I'm talking about, if you will, but they don't say anything about it because it's against the institutional, powers that be. One could get in trouble by going, quite frankly, to where I went to, and and this is something public tend not to know. I don't know whether Dr. Williams, you knew those figures, but only 9%. And as you know, and that was 2011. It's almost gone. And I've looked into some of the reasons for that, the discussions that surrounded that attempt to bring, quote unquote, liberal professors under control that started the Nixon administration. You can see there some decisions being made by a certain Lewis Powell, who then was appointed to the Supreme Court by Nixon, who wrote a document to the Chamber of Commerce at the time, and it was remained secret for 4 or 5 years. But he made it very clear that the problem with in this system of conveying public information was the fact that there were all these liberal professors, he says. And he was particularly identifying ones at Cornell because it's joined by a rather famous Cornellian at the time, a certain man by the name of Olin. And so they really got vigorous at that time to bring this under control, and that's when the tenure started to decline. Somehow, I don't know whether it was the underground movement or what, but I see this as a very serious problem because my colleagues, most of whom don't have tenure or aren't even on tenure track, they're sometimes just contracted. We're now at campuses, we're now contracting people for offering courses, and they better not open their mouths too wide and talk about things that aren't popular. So, in answer to your question, Steve, I think it's very serious. It's serious not just for academics and whether or not they can speak. I think it's a serious matter for the public at large. If you want to, have an institution where they're free to really speak what they have to say, what they have learned, it's getting into a sad state of affairs now. It's a big problem.
So you're asking my experience at University of Chicago, Wayne State, and now Rush. It's been interesting that really it got changed with the gentleman. Forgive me, I won't remember his name because I'm not a gastroenterologist. But the gentleman who went around saying that Helicobacter pylori was the cause of ulcers and he was vilified and thrown out. It's kind of like Semmelweis was put in an insane asylum for saying that people should wash their hands. And it turns out that we've gotten so used to, in the medical side, in academic medicine, of game changers, just flipping what we knew. I mean, how many of us saw the reports on lung cancer if you do more than 55 micrograms of B12 per day? I mean, it's like all the stuff that we think we know, we have to be ready for it to be flipped on its head. And so I don't think we have as much of a problem with it. The problem we have is the financial aspects of tenure. And so, and the lack of productivity in some people who have ruined it for others. And so I actually, because I was a clinical researcher, I had no chance of tenure at the University of Chicago. When I took over the division at Wayne State, I was given tenure. And it was fine for me, but I saw what was happening is that if people were not being clinically productive financially, they could be reduced to their tenure line, which was $25,000. You couldn't live off of that. And so, so devaluing it or making it so, yes, you're tenured, but we can still fire you because you're not doing X, Y, Z. So is it really tenure? Of course not. And so changing the definition, changing the value, that's what I see in academic medicine.
I guess what I'd like to see is that I'm thinking about what you said and I'm concerned about it. And of course I know your story too. And isn't it interesting that in order to tell the truth, you have to get some kind of permission? Seriously, think about what we're saying here. That telling the truth is such a dangerous thing that unless you have some type of insurance policy, you can't tell the truth. And I think that's the problem. And it isn't limited to the university setting. It's limited, I mean, you know what the state tried to do to me, right? You start talking about these things in a truthful manner and the government comes after you or the powers that be come after you. So I think we've got to get to the place where the expectation is that everybody's going to tell the truth and that we start to gain enough personal integrity that we do it whatever the price is. I mean, I got inspired by your willingness to do it. I've thought about you a lot when I've been in a lot of trouble. I didn't blame you, by the way. I just thought, you took a heck of a chance when you started talking about a lot of things that were controversial. And so I think one of the things that we can do to counteract it is, again, to travel in packs, really, and make it safe for people to stand up and say the truth. And if more and more people do it, more and more people will do it.
Let me ask you something very similar. What percentage of the scientific research and development is funded by the private sector, and how does that compare to 50 years ago, and why does this matter?
The same data I referred to a moment ago about the percentage of tenure changing, there was actually the flip side in terms of percent of total research, of medical research, of biological medical research, being funded by private sector. Now with when it got down to 30% academic thing in 2011, 2010, 2011, at that time, now it's said, I'm not sure I agree with these data, but they did the work. 70% of the total research that's being done is funded by the private sector. 70%. So while tenure is going down, the percent of the total being funded by corporate interests is going up. And so I really just don't like it. I think it's a dangerous, dangerous trend. I don't know whether somebody has better numbers than that or not. But
Well, the dangerous trend is that in certain cases, industry has completely bought the academic academia, and it's very. I remember one thing I read about a committee trying to find a psychiatrist, an academic psychiatrist who was not on the payroll of the drug companies. They really couldn't find anybody. I mean, there was no such person available, and there's quite a bit that's been written about the food companies doing this. That they strategize and plan to go out and control, by funding, academia in important ways. And by the way, one thing I think we have to acknowledge, food companies are for-profit entities. They're not social service agencies. And we've got to stop thinking that we're going to do something to them to make them start behaving this way, because that's not what they're going to do. So the only thing that we can do, in my opinion, because the government's so corrupt, I don't think we're going to get any laws passed that really rein them in a meaningful way. And they always rightly say that you can't interfere with their right to do business any more than you can the furniture companies in North Carolina. So we have to dry up demand. That's the only way this is really going to shift, is to dry up demand for things that are not good. Because, and I'll tell you something, this really inspires me when I think about it. When I started in this business 22 years ago, I live in Columbus, Ohio, all right? So there was no good food in grocery stores. They used to have a little section at Kroger. It was about this big, and they called it health food. And then you know what was in the rest of the store, not health food, right? There was one health food store, and it was the size of my bedroom, and you had to wear your beads and sing Aquarius when you went in there, because it was such a strange and unusual place. We used to take people on field trips to the health food store because we were afraid they would just see the people with, all the earrings and everything and tattoos and walk out. So now I want to tell you about Columbus today. This is just the shift in 22 years, all right? And this is based on demand. Today we have 3 Whole Foods, we have 3 Trader Joe's. The Kroger store a mile from my house has everything I want to eat. I don't have to go any further than that. I can go to any restaurant in Columbus and order a meal, and a restaurant owner opening a new restaurant told a Columbus newspaper reporter that she had a lot of plant-based and vegan things on the menu. She said, you really can't operate a restaurant in Columbus, Ohio unless you cater to that population. Now, isn't that a change, right? Okay, so did that happen? Right, fabulous. Oh, and by the way, I used to go into restaurants and tell them I was a vegetarian. They go, oh, you're a veterinarian? I go, no. Okay. So my point is, why did that happen? Do you think that Kroger and Trader Joe and all the restaurants in Columbus got together, and they had a meeting, and they said, you know what, we want to do something really good for the people in Franklin County, so we're going to get together, we're going to feed them healthy food, and they'll come around. That's not what happened. People in Columbus demanded that it change. They were willing to pay for it. And that goes back to what I said. We're all here, we're passionate about this because we want to change things. You have to help us do it, because if we start creating a different demand for a different product and a different way of doing things, eventually that's where the shift will happen. It's the tipping point. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a great book about it. I want to see this get to the tipping point.
Just going to add a little comment about Columbus. So it's actually been good to be on the academic circuit talking about plant-based nutrition. I did almost the entire Big Ten, including Ohio State. And I was there right after White Castle, which originated in Columbus, had started the veggie slider. Mm-hmm. So it was so full of oil that Dr. Esselstyn would not approve. It was not edible, but at least there was no animals in it.
So I'd like to ask you about 8 particular things. If you don't have an opinion on it, you can skip it, but I'd like to ask your opinion on these 8 things, what your thoughts are, if you would recommend this. Number 1, do you recommend people get colonoscopies? Number 2, do you recommend people get mammograms? Number 3, do you recommend PSA tests? Number 4, do you recommend flu shots, annual flu shots? Number 5, do you recommend young girls and boys get the HPV vaccine shot? Number 6, do you recommend stents? Number 7, do you recommend bypass surgery? Number 8, do you recommend angioplasties? If you could Either give no comment if you have no thought, or a thought on those 8 particular things. Colonoscopies 1, mammograms 2, PSA 3, flu shot 4, HPV shot for girls and boys 5, stent 6, bypass surgery 7, and angioplasty 8.
Okay, I'll go first. Colonoscopy, I'll start with that. The Canadian government took colonoscopy off of its list of recommended screenings for most people because there's not a single randomized trial that has ever shown that colonoscopy reduces the risk of dying of colon cancer. And the reason for doing population screening is to reduce the risk of dying or comorbidity. There are other tests that are equally effective and non-invasive, and I think that there are certainly times when colonoscopy is warranted, but as a population screening tool, you simply can't recommend it based on the evidence, in my opinion. Mammography, same thing. The risk of being harmed by a mammogram, by getting mammograms, is 3 times higher than the chance you'll benefit. And the reason is that mammograms are really good at finding small masses like ductal carcinoma in situ that 88% of the time do not develop into cancer. But these patients get treated like cancer patients. So they have surgery, biopsies, surgery, radiation, sometimes chemotherapy, increasingly mastectomy, bilateral mastectomy. Well, the problem with this is that if you don't really have cancer and you get treated like a cancer patient, there's only harm, there cannot be any benefit. What's even more egregious is that all of the women that I'm describing with this particular condition, DCIS, would be alive 5 years later without intervention, so you throw people into the survival pool, which makes it look like breast cancer treatment is better than it actually is, or that it's improving. I happen to be a personal friend of the researcher who discovered prostate-specific antigen. His name is Dr. Richard Ablin, and he wrote a book called The Great Prostate Hoax. He's been trying to tell people for decades now that PSA is not a marker for cancer. It's not a marker for cancer. The only applicability it has is as a marker for somebody who actually has been diagnosed with prostate cancer, as in it has left the prostate capsule, invaded the lymph nodes. It has some usefulness in those cases, but the false positive rate is 78% for that test. So as a screening tool, it's extremely dangerous. The original approval, if you go back to the original approval at the FDA, it was only approved for the monitoring of patients who had been diagnosed with real prostate cancer. And what happened was that every company that made the test violated the approval rules and marketed it for general screening, and then public pressure caused the FDA to approve it later for the general population. So I don't recommend PSA testing. I've written about 4 articles on the flu shot. I just wrote one. The efficacy rate this year is 10%, according to the Australian government. There has never been a year where it's actually been effective. And if you take a look at the incidence of flu, right now you're getting a lot of have you guys seen the stuff about the epidemic of flu? The last time this happened was in 2009 with the H1N1, and CBS did a story on this. In fact, one of our speakers this fall is an investigative reporter who has been involved in some of these kinds of things. So here's what happened. The government, the CDC, World Health Organization, everybody said we're going to have this epidemic of flu, and the numbers weren't hitting the board. They just weren't hitting the board. So the CDC and the World Health Organization instructed physicians to stop testing for flu and to consider anybody who came into the ER or doctor's office who had symptoms, just catalog those as flu cases. Well, a reporter got interested in this and started doing some research and got the records from the various state health departments that were collecting the data, and there was no epidemic of the flu. What happened is everybody who had a cough or a fever, when the government started scaring everybody, went running to the ER and the whole 9 yards. You had an epidemic of people with with fevers and coughs sitting in the ER who were adding to the epidemic. So it would take longer to tell you the story, but it was entirely invented, and it's being entirely invented now. I mean, the actual risk of developing flu in the worst of years is about is a little over 3%, and the flu vaccine maybe reduces it by 1.2% when you get to absolute rather than relative numbers. So all harm, no benefit. The HPV vaccine, I don't think there's ever, we called that the help pay for Vioxx. That's what we think HPV stands for. It was Merck's way to bail themselves out of the last billion-dollar mess they got themselves into. But I mentioned this afternoon. Cochrane Collaboration has sued the European Medicines Agency, alleging scientific fraud and misconduct in the flu and the HPV vaccine. And what happened, I'll tell you, this is the misbehavior that goes on, and you should know this. So a woman in Belgium had a lot of patients coming in who had been injured by HPV, had the shot, and the young girl develops Guillain-Barré, ends up paralyzed, all kinds of things happening. So she wrote up some case reports, and then she asked the European Medicines Agency to look into it. So here's how they looked into it. They wrote to the 2 drug companies who sell the vaccine in Europe and said, we have some allegations that your vaccine could be harmful, so we want you to check your records and see if you see anything that we should be paying attention to. And this is so shocking, they couldn't find any evidence that their vaccines were harmful. So who would know, right? So they wrote up a report saying, we've investigated thoroughly and we can't find any evidence that the vaccine is causing a problem, and the Cochrane folks felt so strongly about it that they sued. HPV is off the schedule in Japan. They've opened centers to take care of the injured women because there are so many. And over 10,000 doctors in Spain have signed a petition saying that this should be taken off the schedule in Spain. I'm going to let my colleague who knows more about cardiology talk about stents, bypass, and angioplasty. I will just say this. I think stents, bypass, and angioplasty are beneficial for certain populations of people, and I would echo all of our comments, I think, through the evening have been that there should be clinical judgment involved, and we seem to have just lost that. So we're doing way too many of these procedures, but for the people they're good for, they do save lives, and if we can just do them to those people, we would be fine. That's what I have to say.
That was amazing, just to listen to all that. That's great job. So I'll just talk about the revascularization stuff, and this has been quite a road during my career, watching them develop. I was actually at Emory when Andreas Grunzig came and brought the technique from Switzerland, and you saw him putting on these courses, and it gradually diffused out all over everywhere to do angioplasties. And then, the Achilles heel was that about 6 months later, 50% of those balloon dilations had failed. And so then they started putting stents in, and the stents looked really good until 6 months later when they had failed. But then they developed drug-eluting stents, and those actually do better. The problem is it leaves a raw surface, so you have to take medication to make sure it doesn't clot. The interesting transition that's happened over the last few years, including just this last big heart association meeting, was the recognition that they were overutilized, and that we really needed to try to focus on the benefit. So how many of you have heard of I had a 3-vessel bypass surgery, right? Most people have heard that term, right? Well, what people don't quite understand is that 2 of those 3 vessels come off of the same one, typically. It's called the left main artery, and that is really critical. When that one gets more than 50% blocked, the death rate, untreated, it gets really high. Now, if you were treating them with Esselstyn diet, perhaps it wouldn't be so high, but we need another major trial isolating the left main, and everyone's afraid of it because it's got such a nasty track record. Then one of those 2 that it gives off is called the left anterior descending. That one has a nickname. It's called the Widowmaker, but it's really only the upper portion of it before it starts to give off all the branches, so that if you narrowed that or if you clotted that off, you would take out all these, probably around 50% of your heart. And so it's hard to survive that. Now, if you were to exclude, and I'm sorry for anyone who's had a stent in here in the rest of the circulation, but if you were to exclude the left main and the proximal left anterior descending, there's never been anything to show that you improve the outcome of a patient. And I know that's a strong statement, but there's general recognition now that even though people are still doing it, and I know there's some hotbeds of this here in New York, that putting stents in the right coronary artery, if someone's having a heart attack, that's different, okay? But for the stable coronary artery disease, there's no evidence that these other places are actually improving outcomes. So what the excuse was, that we can relieve angina, that is the angina pectoris, that chest pain that someone gets. They should be able to walk further on the treadmill. They should be able to climb stairs and not have to worry about, the chest discomfort, because it hurts, but also that they're going to have a rhythm disturbance and have sudden cardiac death, like an Agatha Christie novel when somebody steals your nitroglycerin, none of which is true, by the way. And so we were sort of into that until very recently, when a trial that you might want to look up if you're interested in this is called the Orbita trial. gutsy folks actually did a sham procedure where they pretended to put stents in half the people and put stents in the other half. And people signed up for it, so it was perfectly legitimate, and you didn't know which group you were randomized to. And they did everything as if they were putting in a stent, and other people, and the people versus the people who did get the stents. And the outcomes were actually the same. And so that really has thrown the interventional community for a loop. I love to hear them, backpedaling and tap dancing about, how poorly designed, and they may have some legitimate points, but at least it will give us pause about doing them sort of on a widespread nature when it's not left main, proximal left anterior descending. And the other part of that, being a card-carrying nuclear cardiologist still, is that one can do tests to try to figure out how much muscle is involved. And if it's a small amount, back 10 years ago, we were taking these tiny little abnormalities on nuclear stress testing and say, you have to have a stent, and it was never really true. And a guy who's at Cleveland Clinic, Roy Hakamowicz, showed us those crossing lines. If you don't have 13% of your muscle, that is a little more than an eighth of your heart, that's in trouble, doing those stents did not do you any good. And so you have to have a lot of muscle that's in trouble. Now, Rory Hakamowicz, I've always challenged him, he's a great guy. I would challenge him to see what could we do with diet. Where does that line move if you start doing diet? And I bet it's going to move to the right substantially.
I'm just next in line. Fortunately, I'm not a clinician, so I don't know too much about that sort of thing. I think I'll pass to my friend.
Well, I'm not going to challenge anything that Pam has said, except that there are two friends of mine who, in their late 70s, had a PSA that was a little borderline, and they, 6 months later, they got another one, and it had really gone up, and that ended up getting them biopsies, and then they ended up having one of them getting pretty sophisticated radiation treatment, and the other did the operation. And they had a pretty high level of invasiveness in the terms of the, what's the score? The Gleason score. And I think that they've, their PSA now is 0. So, but, all the rest of it, Pam, I think, has done an excellent job of reviewing that. It's interesting, historically, I feel very fortunate in that in 1958 at the Cleveland Clinic, there was a fellow by the name of Mason Soanes, who was head of the Cleveland Clinic catheterization laboratory. And he was looking at the image amplifier while his associate was putting the catheter in, and at that point, it was considered fatal to catheterize the coronary arteries. The coronary arteries are supposed to carry blood, not contrast material. And so they shot the plunger, and Mason was horrified because they were doing, at that point, catheterizations to look at the ventricle and look at the valves, because you could operate on the ventricle and the valves and help these people, but it wasn't in the ventricle. The whole ventricle shot went into the coronary artery, and Mason was looking at the image amplifier, looking at the EKG, flatlined. He yelled at the patient to cough. The patient coughed, came back, and coronary artery angiograms were born. But then that was 1958. 1963, when I was rotating through cardiothoracic surgery as part of my training in general surgery, there was a tall fellow there from Argentina who was starting the residency with me. I was just going to be there for 3 months as part of my rotation, but he was interested. He'd been a general surgeon in Argentina for a decade, that he wanted to learn about cardiothoracic surgery, and he was wonderful. He was such a friend, great pair of hands, very creative mind. His interpersonal skills were excellent. And when he went back to Argentina after getting his training at the clinic, it was not a great reception. Big deal, you got trained in Cleveland. What are we supposed to do, roll over? So he came back to Cleveland, and he was such a wonderful resident. They put him on the staff full time. I'm giving you a little historical aspect. So the wonderful thing was that this guy got along extremely well with Mason Soanes. So here they had all this backlog of thousands and thousands of patients. People were coming from all over the world to see how horrible their coronary arteries were. There was nothing that could be done. There was no surgery for it. There was no angioplasty for it. There was no stenting for it. There were no bypasses. And when I was in Vietnam in May of 1967, this Spaniard, his name was Rene Favallaro, and he had a patient. He was operating on the heart. Suddenly it was getting blue. He yelled at his team to prep the leg. They took out a vein, went above and below the blockage because he'd seen the x-rays, and sure enough, coronary artery surgery was born. And Soanes fed Favallaro just case after case after case, and Favallaro was so creative, wrote up the monogram, wrote up paper after paper after paper. He was recognized throughout the world as the father of bypass surgery, and he had such a command of language. He could speak Spanish, English, Italian, and French. So practically anywhere he went in the world, he could make the company feel honored and at home, getting some common language that they could work with. And there was no question that bypass was suddenly picked up by everybody, and this was going to be the salvation, a mechanical approach to a biological disease. But as we've learned more and more about that, we now really realize that that's an enormously expensive operation with tremendous morbidity and really significant mortality. 3% of people who get that operation across the board are going to die. So if you do 1,000 of those, 30 people will be killed. And there is mortality even with stents. So these are not innocuous procedures. And right now, cardiovascular medicine is responsible for 45% of Medicare. 45%. And what is that 45%? It's drugs, and it's stents, and it's bypasses, which have nothing whatsoever to do with the causation of the illness. And so I guess I'm not a great fan, although I admire the hell out of both Mason Soanes, who was my patient, and also Favallaro, who was a marvelous human being. I just know that if they were on this panel today, they would absolutely be right at the forefront of wanting whole food, plant-based nutrition. They were that kind of person.
So, although it's wonderful to have you, you guys are all leaving in the next day or two. And that means we have to fend for ourselves. So the newspaper is going to have articles. I don't know what their source is, but you know, our newspapers here are, you know, they're mainstream newspapers. Our doctors all were educated, and I'm not sure who decided on what they learned in med school. I don't know if the medical industry was involved in their curriculum. We're told, I don't know if the clinical trials are accurate or not, I'm not sure. I don't know if university information is accurate. I don't know if the CDC, FDA, USDA are giving me accurate information. When someone says it's scientific research, I don't know if it's accurate. So most people do believe that the newspaper and the med doctors and the clinical trials and the universities and the CDC are pretty much accurate. I'm not so sure now. I mean, you know, the more we learn, the more I realize that it seems like there's a financial interest influencing all of these things. What's your thoughts? I mean, what should we feel comfortable and trust and feel good about? And what should we be very weary and feel like they're giving an answer that there was someone used their financial influence to influence these things? So what should we listen to? What should we believe? How should we think after you leave about it?
I'll start. Well, first of all, some of the agencies that you mentioned, you know, one of the laws that was passed by our illustrious Congress in 1992 allows the drug companies to fund the FDA. Last year, the drug companies paid the FDA $787 million and change, and the approval rate for drugs was 96%. So I would love to see the 4% they turned down. It must be like intravenous arsenic, and there was probably a conversation in the hallway. We wanted to approve it all, but we got to look like we're paying attention, so submit it next year, you know. So, and there are some good people who work at the FDA, by the way. We had a physician take our physician training course because she wanted to do better. So what we have is good apples in a bad barrel, if that makes any sense. A lot of good apples and a lot of bad barrels. So here's what I tell the folks who come to us for information. The first thing is, make it your job to learn how to read research. I teach a course, I'm teaching a course in that to lay people. I've taught health professionals how to do this for a long time, but I can teach lay people how to do it too. So you learn how to read this information so that you can start to make decisions for yourself. The second thing is you have to get grounded in a philosophy, and then it's not that you're not open to new information, but you're not floating in the breeze that every time you hear something new or you see a headline in the newspaper, you're jumping off the cliff on another tangent to some other crazy diet or some magical supplement or whatever. The third thing is that a guy by the name of Dr. Pam Popper, not a relation of mine, by the way, he was living in London at the time, and he said one of the problems with people is that what you should do is when you hear a new idea is try to prove it wrong. And if it's right, it'll persevere, and if it's wrong, you'll let go of it. And people do the opposite. They hear a new idea, assume it's right, and then get attached to it and almost, fervent about hanging on to it, reluctance to give it up. And I think we need to change that so that, I guess the best thing I could tell you is that a lot of what you see and read, if not most of it, is wrong. Assume that it is until proven otherwise. And I think you'll save yourself from a lot of grief.
That's very well said. I do, with all of due respect to our industry colleagues, we do have worries about they are not always going to be on our side. They have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders and not necessarily to science. But having said that, there's a lot of good science that does go and a lot of information that we are able to get, and there's ways of making money out of excellent science. So we don't want to throw it all under the bus, but I would say that we have a responsibility, as Dr. Popper was saying, we all have a responsibility to learn and to go in with the humility. When they say that medical knowledge doubles every 2 years, if that's still true, it's probably even faster now, then we have to be willing to have a little bit of whiplash and, be ready to turn 180 degrees on things that we knew last year, which we find out are no longer true. And so I think that's the approach that we have to have.
I get asked that question, Steve, so often. How, for somebody in the public, how do we interpret whether or not something is true or not? They're reading this, that, and everything else. And in the area of nutrition, this has been a particular problem because we got lots and lots of nutrients, lots and lots of things we can claim, a lot of discoveries, grows, multiplies every 2 years or whatever it is. We have such an enormous amount of information. And it got me to thinking, too, that not only is it not possible for the public to really interpret the validity of some of this information, but there's something a little deeper than this. And that is the fact that we are so reductionist in our thinking. We do it in research, we do it in practice, and we think about the details. We think about the details so much. And the obvious opportunity for controversy is endless when we take that approach. And so, I call that essentially technology. That's not necessarily science. I'm being a little bit hard on that, but there's a bigger message here, especially regarding the whole food plant-based diet, that we should pay attention to. We should not get caught in the weeds and talk about so much about the details, and pay a little more attention to the more comprehensive effect of, let's say, this total diet, how it works, what kind of endpoints it creates, and that sort of thing. And I like the word holism, as I mentioned in my lecture, and I think I hope, I'm really impressed with the way the cell works when we think about that concept, how everything works together. It's fantastic. It's nature at work, and somehow we've gotten in the business of being technologists instead of scientists. We're always looking for an easy answer, this, that. The opportunity for controversy is just enormous. And so I don't actually think we can hope ever to train people who are not in the field to really be able to interpret whether something's valid or not valid. I think there just needs to be this recognition that a lot of claims will be made. They do make newspapers. If they make money, they make a lot of news. That's just the way it is. And I think we need to back off and look at the bigger picture, because there's so much to offer. And the whole food plant-based diet, with these innumerable numbers of agents that act as causes, all these mechanisms, so forth. You know, nature's a beautiful thing. You know, the default position of the cell is to create health. You stop and think about it. The default position of the cell and the body is to create health. And so we do things to ourselves that's not in the best interest of the body. We do it all the time. The body's always struggling to regain that homeostasis, that sort of comfortable place to create life and health. And so I think we need to spend more time thinking about the big question, whole food plant-based diets. This is not a magic pill. It's just, it has this very broad sweep of effects, and just sort of back off and marvel a bit at nature, what it can do. And don't be so anxious to jump in there with the latest fad, do this, that, or something else. Just let nature play its course. And so that's one of the reasons I like that holistic idea. And then not worry too much about it. Just be aware. If we see, I think you said, one of you said something about when something new comes out, we need to test it, we need to screen it, we have to prove it wrong. That's a fundamental concept of science, really. You know, trying to falsify hypotheses. That's classic. And so I totally agree with that approach. And so just let some of the rest of it pass by.
Well, this has been great. I mean, it's so exciting to have an engaged audience like you folks have been. When I started surgery, when I came back from Vietnam, I was offered a position as a general surgeon at the Cleveland Clinic. Probably one of the most frequent operations I was asked to do was for peptic ulcer. And as Kim Williams has pointed out tonight, when these crazy Australians, was it Warren and Matthews or something like that? I have not got it right, but they... Marshall. There you go. You're doing your homework. Was it Warren? Was it Warren and Marshall? Is that right? Yeah, it was two. Well, they kept saying that they could find these little bacteria in these gastric specimens. And of course we said, look, you guys are from down under. You just don't seem to get it. No organisms are going to live in intense normal hydrochloric acid. But they were right. They were right. And the whole field, I wasn't the only one doing surgery for peptic ulcer disease. I mean, this was the mother lode for surgeons. That's where they made a fortune, doing all these operations. Destroying the gastrointestinal tract, doing vagotomy, gastrectomy, partial gastrectomy, pyloroplasty. And it was gone. It absolutely suddenly was gone. Here is the mother lode for surgeons, and it's gone. Well, you know, this is gonna happen. Believe it or not, it's gonna be harder with something like cardiovascular disease and these other common illnesses because so many other embedded areas are conflicted. But it is going to happen. And one of the things that strikes me as very interesting, you've always heard me say that what was going to move this forward is not the hype and the snake oil. What it's going to be is the science. And just recently, I've been involved with charming a certain benefactor who has now funded the Journal of Disease Reversal, which will be a marvelous invitation to people to get those studies in there, whether it's not only with vascular, but also all the other ones that we've been talking about tonight as well will be invited. And that will really, hopefully, begin to push the rock up the hill a lot faster. Thank you.
Okay, if you would like to ask we have time for a very few questions that I can call on a few people. So raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. That lady right there, okay, please give her the microphone.
First, I'd like to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Dr. Esselstyn and Dr. Campbell, Dr. Williams, and Dr. Popper. My question is for Dr. Popper. Dr. Popper, you spoke about the flu shot. Well, this is something really personal, and I really need a lot of help with that. Recently, I used to work for NYU Winthrop in December, this past December, and I was told that if I don't get the flu shot, I'm going to be terminated. So I was terminated because I didn't get the flu shot. Not only was I terminated, but I'm not allowed to get my unemployment. And so now I have to have a hearing to try to battle with them to try to get some unemployment while I'm looking for a job.
Okay, I have some, can I start?
Please.
I start you there? Okay. The first thing is there are lawsuits being filed against medical institutions for not allowing people to use the religious exemption for flu. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has gotten involved in these, and they've managed, and some of them are getting settled out of court because the institutions know they're going to lose. So the first thing I would tell you is contact the EEOC and see if they will file a lawsuit on your behalf. They're doing a bunch of them right now. The second thing is that the Trump administration set up a division in Health and Human Services to, and I can't remember the name of this, but if you will send me an email, I'll send you the information. I filmed a video clip about it, so you'll hear about this next week, those of you who are going to be on my video clips list. Anyway, the bottom line is that this is to make sure that people do not have to go against their religious beliefs to perform abortion or assisted suicide, et cetera. But the portal, I went to the portal where you file the complaint. It invites anybody who has been unable to use religious exemption in a medical setting to file a complaint. And I put on my video clip, which you'll see next week, that we need to flood the system. We need to flood the system. The other thing is we have a law pending in Ohio to make the mandate illegal. And we got it out of committee, and the drug companies did a switcheroo and got it back into committee. Long story about this because there's a lot of money in these vaccines. But the bottom line is that see if you can start a movement to get the law changed in New York, because there's a growing list or group of dissenters who are interested in doing something, who are quite active. But I would file a complaint and call EEOC and see if you can file a lawsuit.
Thank you very, very much.
Hi. They didn't go so much into the chia seeds and all that, which I use a lot. Is it necessary to take EPA and DHA, or can you get enough? Because I don't use fish and all that. And how much chia seeds or hemp seed, assuming we're not using regular oil, how much of that is healthier and how much isn't? Because I'm totally confused at this point. Thank you.
Your question is whether you're getting enough omega-3? Yes. Is that right? Well, yeah. First of all, you're going to get lots of omega-3 in plant-based nutrition, and there's plenty of omega-3 in green leafy vegetables, and you heard how often it's kind of nice to have those.
Right.
And and I ask my patients to take a couple of tablespoons of either flaxseed meal or chia seeds, which yeah, and you can always have your omega-3 level checked, and if you're normal, you're fine.
Okay.
If you're still a little bit low, just increase your intake.
Okay, thank you.
One other thing I'll mention is vegans and vegetarians tend to have lower DHA levels, but it's never been linked to any disadvantage. In other words, the observation that somebody's numbers are slightly low doesn't necessarily mean that that person is sick. And so you see a lot of the justification for supplementation is, oh, the vegans are low. Well, show me some evidence that the vegans are sick because they have lower DHA levels, and then I'll start worrying about it a whole lot more.
There's an underlying thing here, too, I think most of us know about, and that is this ratio of the 6s to the 3s. They really matter. And when, in fact, we're using a whole food plant-based diet, in low in fat, low in total fat is another factor that it comes into play. When we're low in the fat, total fat, and total whole food plant-based diet, then we're at a ratio of something like 1:1, 2:1, omega-6 to 3. That's apparently ideal, it appears to be. But actually, in the population at large, I see various numbers, but it's something like 15:1 to 20:1. I see these kind of figures for omega-6 to omega-3. So we, quite frankly, are living on a fairly pro-inflammatory type diet and also high-fat diet. So the combination of high fat, lots of added oil, usually omega-6, we're really out of whack. And under those circumstances, then omega-3, one can maybe make a reasonable argument, you know, to take some 3s or whatever it is, or whatever to kind of rebalance things. But we don't need to be there. And as I say, if we're doing the right thing, then everything falls into place. And so it's a different ball game, it seems to be, before we recommend that.
Well, and to your point, there have been a lot of meta-analyses that have looked at the benefits of taking omega-3 type supplements to reduce the risk of anything. And you find these little studies out there that show a little bit of benefit, but it completely gets wiped out in the meta-analysis. And I think what the message is, the take-home point, is that an omega-3 pill is not going to make up for your dietary indiscretions. You know, so really you want to get the omega-6s down. That's really the only way to deal with this if your actual goal is health improvement. It's not to try to take in enough omega-3 to get the ratio right with the continued intake of omega-6.
This lady right here.
Hi. In listening to you all, and I do believe in just about everything you said, but over the years, so many things have been said that, you know, eggs were good, then they're not good, then the fatty fish is good, then it's not good. How do we know, and how do we know for sure? I'm just a little afraid to go so extreme, if that's the right word. How do we know that come tomorrow, something is going to come out that a little bit of red meat or a little bit of oil is healthier in the long run? Thank you.
That question really comes back to my point about reduction science, worrying too much about the details. Really, I almost let that pass by. We don't need to be that precise trying to figure it out, because we might be an individual who doesn't respond that way anyhow compared to someone else. So I wouldn't, I know it's a cop-out, sounds like a cop-out, but in reality, those kind of detailed questions seem to me not to be worth the attention that they seem to get. I'm sorry about that, but that's...
Yeah, I would concur with Colin, because you know, you just can get yourself so tied up in knots, worrying about this reductionism we're talking about. To make an example, let me make it simple as I can. When Bill Connor, the late Bill Connor, when he went down to northern Mexico and he studied 583 Tarahumara Indians and drew their blood, first of all, none of them, not one, was overweight. 2, not one had hypertension, and none had any nutritional deficiencies. And what did the Tarahumara eat? The 3 sisters: beans, corn, and squash. Pretty simple. I hope that answers your question. Keep it simple.
Maybe I could just rephrase your question for a moment. That is, when do you take the level of evidence as high enough to actually change your own behavior? And I would say that opinions are really probably, if they're isolated opinions that are really not based on any science, we would take them not at all. When you have observational trials that are published, and a lot of the things that I talk about are observational trials because we don't have anything else, then you can put some weight on it, but you'd feel more comfortable if there were multiple trials that all said the same thing. When you put those together, like the omega-3 analysis that was done, really just published the last couple of weeks, saying that, yeah, it's pretty much worthless. That was adding up a massive amount of data, some randomized, some observational, but mostly randomized. Well, when randomized trials, meaning that somebody gets a fake pill and the other person gets the real pill, or in case of diet, it's a little tough to do placebo controls. But the idea is that if you do a randomized trial that lasts a very long time, so that you have hard endpoints, not, oh yeah, your LDL cholesterol went down 10 points, but no, you had less heart attack, stroke, and death, and large numbers, then you can feel comfortable that that level of evidence is something that really should be game-changing. in how we approach patient care or our own habits. And so I really would pay attention to not just what people say, but the hardness, the crispness of the evidence.
One thing that, this goes back to something I said earlier, which is I think that we spend a lot of time on this type of education in our office because people have to be grounded in this philosophy. Not grounded in it because of what I say. Doing what I say isn't taking control of your health. You've just substituted one person telling you what to do for another person telling you what to do, and that's how people end up in my office. I'm a busy girl every afternoon I show up for work because people have been following directions without knowing what they should be choosing and looking at all the evidence. So I think the first step is you've got to learn how to look at this and understand the evidence enough to be pretty grounded. Again, like I said, not so that you're closed-minded to anything, but you're not so willing to shift with the breeze. The other thing is that I got an interesting email this week from somebody who said, you know, you've been posting those video clips for, gosh, it's probably 6 or 7 years now. Are there any that you should take off because they're outdated? And I said, no. And the reason is this. New in the research field can be better. When we find out new things, it's exciting. But new doesn't necessarily mean better. All right? There's a lot of junk that comes out that's new. And so a good example of stuff that we've known a lot of this stuff, I mean, you were the one who, the first lecture I ever listened to on protein, Dr. Campbell, was yours. Going back to over 100 years ago, we knew that high protein diets were bad. Okay, so we've known for over 100 years that those diets are bad. The new stuff, new about protein, really isn't all that good. For the studies are highly flawed, but they don't really change the 100 years of evidence that we have. And so I think that I wouldn't confuse new with quality, I guess is what I'm saying. You really have to look at these studies, who did them, does this really change the prevailing thought, or is this an outlier kind of thing sponsored by industry designed to show that eggs are good for you when they're really not? By the way, the Egg Board manipulated all of that. I don't know if you guys know this, but they started doing studies after the government decided that we're not going to fund research on cholesterol and smoking because we basically knew all that we needed to know. Bad for you, smoking and eating cholesterol. Well, the Egg Board looked at that and said, this is our opportunity. So they started doing their own studies, and what they were doing was adding eggs to people's diets who are already consuming like 500 or 600 or 700 milligrams of cholesterol a day. You don't see much change, right? So they reported, you know, it's not harmful to eat eggs because people ate extra eggs and their cholesterol didn't go up. Well, then what they did is they did a meta-analysis of all of their studies. The inclusion criteria was the research that they had done. The cutoff point was the date when they started doing research, which eliminated all the government research that showed that eating cholesterol is bad for you, and pronounced that all the new research shows that cholesterol is safe to consume. So that's why you have to be careful of new. There's a lot of manipulation to report a result that an industry, a particular industry, wants you to believe.
If you would each like to take 1 minute and give any final thoughts or any closing statement or any final thing you want to leave us with.
I'll go first. So I guess my final statement is thank you, Steve Shore. You rock.
I'd just like to say I'm glad you're here. We need more. We need more of you. Okay. You know, if you look at what's, you know, we've talked about a lot of issues in healthcare. We've mentioned the expense. You know, if you think about what we're spending on healthcare, well, it's sick care, right? If we think about what we're spending on it, and instead of, you know, college education for poor people or roads and bridges, there's so many other things we could do with that money. That I think that we should tell all of our friends and family that it's their patriotic duty to become a vegan.
You missed my talk today. Vegans, I don't use that word because vegan fat content and sugar content of vegan diets is equal to that of meat eaters, by the way. It really is the biggest survey so far, 10 keys has worked. No, I would echo what Dr. Williams and Dr. Popper said, that it's fantastic to talk to a group like this. Obviously very enthusiastic, very informed, I think, group as well. And you know, when we're in the weeds, involved in institutional issues and problems, being either part of institutions and so government, academia, whatever it happens to be, it gets a little bit troublesome and tiresome at times. And the only way that I can see everything happening in the future is exactly this kind of thing right here. You folks getting together, showing some interest, and really getting involved, because that's the only way I think that's going to work is from the ground up. So it's been a fantastic delight for me to actually be in the presence of these kind of colleagues and you as participants. Thank you.
Well, it's interesting when you try to get your arms around science as an audience, and I just would, although we hear a lot about randomized trials, there's a very interesting history in medicine. When Jonathan Snow took the handle off the Broad Street pump because of the cholera epidemic, he had found out that the sewage intake was coming in upstream from the pump, took the handle off the pump, and the epidemic went away. Not a randomized trial. Along came Morton and invented ether, not a randomized trial. Then along came a guy named Semmelweis, Theodore Koch, and Pasteur and Lister. No randomized trial. Learned all about the bacterial importance of illness. Then along come Banting and Best. We discovered insulin. Alexander Fleming and Florey, penicillin. And then again, in the back of the room, the second name for the people that discovered peptic ulcer, Helicobacter, doctor, what? Warren and Marshall, that's it. God, I got to write that down. So it's, I think you're a very acquisitive audience, and there's going to be other things that come along. And there was a Nobel laureate who was a physicist who made the following observation that I think is key, he said, in the scientific method is what? We propose a theory, and then we do the experiment. The experiment is either right or it is wrong. It does not depend upon the wealth of the investigator, the personality, how persuasive they are. It is either right or it is wrong. You are a wonderfully sophisticated audience, and it's such an honor for me to be here with you. And I wish you all an exciting days ahead in your plant-based world. Thank you.